Hashem tells Avram, I want you to go to the land of Canaan. Over there, I will make your name great. You will become very wealthy. People will know you. And he comes to the land of Canaan. He's 75 years old at this time. But when he arrives, there's a drought, there's a great famine. There's nothing to eat. So what does Avram do? He decides to go down to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, in search of food. Now, this decision by Avram itself was subject to debate in the Mefarshim. Some say, Rashi says, that it actually highlights the greatness of Avram. Here, Hashem promised him, leave everything behind, come to Canaan, and there you'll become wealthy. Here you'll become famous. You'll become a blessing to all the nation, for all the nations. And yet, as soon as he arrives, there's nothing doing. In fact, there's a famine, and he has to pick himself up and start foraging for food. So it was a great test. Hashem, so to speak, forcing him out of Canaan. And Avram nevertheless didn't question, and he faithfully traveled to Mitzrayim. The Ramban, Nachmanides, disagrees. He says this was actually a great sin on the count of Avram. He should have had complete faith in Hashem that he would find the food in Canaan. Hashem told you to go to Canaan, stay in Canaan. We'll revisit this discussion further on. So Avram and Sarai, as she's known at the time, proceeds to descend, going south towards Mitzrayim. Upon approaching Mitzrayim, Avram, noticing the nature of the culture of this land, how exceedingly immoral, decadent, and wicked these people are, he turns to Sarai and he says, well, now I've realized that you're an exceedingly beautiful woman, and this is going to present to us a problem. Because the Mitzrayim will desire you, and therefore, in order to clear the path to accessing you, they will kill me. So therefore, we have a dilemma. What are we going to do about you? Now, this exact calculation of Avram will explain momentarily why he was so sure that they would murder him. But in any case, how do you get out of this predicament? So what's Avram's strategy? His strategy is as follows. We are going to deny that we are in a spousal relationship. I am not your husband, you're not my wife. And therefore, Imri na achaisiyat, please, I need you to tell them that you are my sister. Laman yitav li bavureich, and therefore, it will be good for me on your behalf. V'chaisa nafshi b'glalech, and therefore, I will survive, I will live because of you. This is Avram's strategy. In the end, she is taken to the house of the palace of Parai, and miraculously, there's great afflictions. They all realize that something is amiss. They realize that something is not right, and they dig deeper into the story, and miraculously, Sarai is spared, and they bestow upon Avram and Sarai many gifts, and he becomes quite wealthy. So that's the happy ending of the story. But let's go back to the drama, to the moment of tension as Sarai is with Avram when they're coming down to Mitzrayim. Here, he realizes they're both in danger. Avram, he perceives his life to be in danger, and Sarai, there is this possibility that the Mitzrayim will lust her and she will be damaged. She will be in a very, very compromised situation. So what's Avram's strategy here? What does he do? He right away, it's baffling, his approach. he seems to be totally insensitive, apathetic to the situation that Sarah is going through and the very, very difficult position that he's going to put her in. He seems very much preoccupied with what will be with him, what is his fate. He's saying, tell them that you're my sisters in order that I should live. Okay, let's even assume for a moment that Avram will live and Sarah is the sister. Now you have just exposed her. You've just made her vulnerable, made her even more accessible to the Egyptians. What's going to be with her? What's her fate going to be?
Hello.
And
yes.
The question is, seemingly, you can't say now Avram, he would rely, that's a miracle will happen to Sarai. She's a very righteous person, and Hashem will take care of her. Well, if that's the case, if you're so confident that Hashem will perform a miracle, why is Avram coming up with all these strategies and coming up with all these plans how to save himself, rely on a miracle from Hashem? If you're so confident. And if you're not so confident, why are you taking care of yourself and not considering what will happen to Sarah? Now you could say, Avram looked at the situation and he thought, it's impossible. The odds are stacked against me. We're in the superpower empire of the time, Egypt. They are too powerful, too strong to overcome. Maybe, but the reality is, if you look at Avram and his history, his track record, he never really cared much about statistics, about chances, polls. That wasn't Avram's thing. We look even in this week's Parsha, there was this great battle you could say, the First World War between 5 kingdoms and 4 kingdoms. It was a tremendous, tremendous battle. The 4 kings were so powerful that they overcame the 5 kings. And now these kings, they were so powerful, and yet they captured Lot, the nephew of Avram. So after such a tremendous battle, and they were feared and they were respected, Avram didn't think twice. He goes with Eliezer and he takes them all on, this entire battle. Even if you're going to say, according to the Mefarshim, maybe there were, when it says Avram, he also had the 300 plus 318 servants with him, but still, he took on an entire superpower to save Lot. He didn't care what people thought. He didn't think about what were his chances, what were the statistics saying. So why is Avram right now suddenly very nervous about what's going to be with the Mitzrayim, what's going to be with my own life to save my own skin? And we know that Avram was very, very dedicated and devoted to his dear wife, no matter what the difficult circumstances. In Ur Kasdim, for many, many years, they were childless. They had no children. At this point, he's already 75. So for many years, he hasn't had children. He had difficulties with Nimrod, all the stories we know from the Medrash, and he stuck with Sarai through thick and thin. And even in the end of days, upon her passing, we see the great lengths he goes to purchase and acquire a burial plot for her in Ma'aras Machpelah, the negotiations that take place, and the exorbitant price that he pays to procure a burial plot for her. And yet, in this story, he seems to be so callous and so insensitive to Sarai. He wants to save his skin, and Sarai is left vulnerable to the Mitzrayim. The truth is, the Ramban, Nachmanides, in his commentary, he says that this was also a sin. It seems that he says, Avram, one sin begets another sin. He shouldn't have been down here in Mitzrayim in the first place. And in fact, his strategy and his approach to take care of himself and leave Sarah vulnerable and on her own was something that was not proper. It was a sin as well. He should have had faith and stood by her no matter what the situation. That's the approach of Ramban. However, we can't, at least according to many Mefarshim, we can't say that. Rashi, we know for sure, disagrees with the Ramban, because Rashi already told us earlier that the fact that Avram came down here was a testament to his great faith. It was not the lack of faith that he came down to Mitzrayim. In fact, he stood by Hashem's command no matter what. In fact, we know that in the Medrash and other sources, we know that Avram was tested. He was with 10 trials, with 10 tests, 10 nisyonos. And this story with Sarai is known to be as one of the 10 tests. Now, as the Mishnah in Perkei Avos tells us that Avram was tested with 10 tests, v'amad b'kulam, he prevailed, he triumphed in all of these 10 tests. So we have to look at the story through a lens such that everything Avram did was perfect, at least in this story, in the sense that it's not just a behavior we should learn from what not to do, we should aspire. There's a lesson over here. There's something very, very powerful, very profound that could guide us in our lives. And another point, why it's difficult to say that Avram sort of messed up. There was a lack of faith, a lack of concern or compassion, empathy, something that's amiss in the story. Because when we continue to read the narrative of Avram and Yitzchak, the story happens again. It happens again with Avram. His wife he has an issue with Avimelech and Plishtim, Melech Gerar, Yitzchak as well with Rivka. The story repeats itself. So if it was a one-off thing, a one-time lapse on Avram's part, perhaps we could understand. But if this becomes a recurring theme, now we need to understand what was wrong. Why did Avram approach this challenge in this particular way? All of these questions, in truth, pale in comparison to even a bigger and more shocking statement that Rashi makes. When Avram tells Sarai, Imrina achesiyat, please tell them that you are my sister. What does he say? Laman yitav li ba'avurech, in order that it should be good for me on your account, because of you, and I will live because of you. So there seems to be a redundancy here. The main point Avram is saying is that I will live, I will survive because of you, because you're going to make this statement. So what is Laman yitav li ba'avurech? It'll be good, it'll be better for me because of you. Isn't that what he means? Is that he will? So what is Laman yitav li ba'avurech? So Rashi says, Manitav li ba'avurech means they will yitnu li matanos. They will give me gifts. So now, in this moment, such high stakes drama, there's what's at stake over here is Sarai and everything, her life, her future is hanging in the balance. And here they're at the border. The Mitzrayim can make any kind of decision. What is Avram preoccupied with? Not only about saving his own skin. And with Sarai, whatever happens, happens. Am I going to get gifts? Is there a way I could parlay this entire situation to my benefit to the extent that I will become enriched? I will become wealthy. I want gifts. Is that what Avram's thinking about right now? How he could exploit Sarai in this situation to his financial benefit? That seems to be the most outrageous and most disturbing thing that Avram could do in such a situation. And in general, to say that Avram cares about money, we know that when he and Sarai had their guests in their tent, for those who would thank Hashem, who would bench Hashem after eating, he wouldn't charge them. Later in the parsha, when we read about his victory to liberate Lot, the king of Sodom says, "Come, ten li anefesh v'rechush kachlach." He tells Avram, "Take all of the money, all the spoils. It's all yours." Avram says, "No, I will not even take a shoelace out of the spoils. No one should say that I enriched Avram." He didn't want to take anything. And here, Avram's obsession, he's fixated. There's a preoccupation about saving himself and about receiving matanos. Some of the Mefarshim, such as the Abarbanel, the Sfarnu, they say that Avram, by saying Imrina Chesiyat, saying you are my sister, he was just really trying to buy time. In other words, he was trying to devise a scheme how he could escape, how he could get out of the situation. But he needed to buy time. So he said, say you are my sister. Why say you're my sister? Because we see in their society at that time, the shidduchim, all of the negotiations would often be done not via the parents, but through the siblings. If you think about the story of the shidduch of Yitzchak, who's doing all the negotiations? It wasn't Besuel, the father, it was Lavan, the brother. He is negotiating the shidduch of his sister Rivka. We see the same thing in other situations. Later, when Shem is trying to negotiate a relationship for Dinah, who does Shem negotiate? Not with Yaakov, but with the brothers, with the Shvatim. It seems perhaps in those days that was the norm. And this would explain why Avram wanted gifts, why he wanted matanas, because it was the dowry of Sarah that he was negotiating, which would buy them some time. He didn't really want the money, but through this negotiation, he would be able to filibuster, he'd be able to delay and stall and figure out a way how to extricate himself from this predicament. Maybe that sounds like a nice explanation, but still, it doesn't explain, if that is so, why, when it didn't work out, clearly, at some point, it didn't go his way. Sarah was taken to the palace of Parai. He didn't stop him then. He didn't make a stand, even as if it was suicidal, some kamikaze mission, nothing. He doesn't appear to, he just lets the natural course of events take its path, to run its course. Before we get to that, to explain that, we need to momentarily explain the logic of Avram. As we mentioned before, Avram says like this: they will lust Sarai, and therefore they're going to want to take her. But if they think she's in a relationship, she's married, they will kill me. Better I say you are my sister, that you are unmarried, and then they will not kill me. The question is, why was he so confident? These Egyptians are immoral. They have no scruples. They have no ethics. They just do what they want. So even if Avram would say, I'm married, right? Okay, so adultery is a sin, but so is murder. Why was Avram so confident that they would rather murder him and then take Sarai, being available, becoming single again, as opposed to just bypassing, just let Avram live? What do they gain? So it's adultery. Why were they so confident that they'd rather commit murder than adultery? There's an interesting letter that the Rebbe penned in response to a question. There's a fascinating medrash. It's known as a medrash pliya, one of these cryptic, wondrous midrashim that says as follows: Imrina chesiyat, on the statement that Avram requests Sarai to say that she is his sister. The medrash says, Mikan from here, we derive sheshochatin lechola b'Shabbos, that we slaughter for a ill person on Shabbos. The situation is that a person is ill on Shabbos. Now, the doctor says that this individual needs to eat fresh meat. So there's two options. One option is there's readily available fresh meat, but it's not kosher. In order to have kosher meat that is fresh, you need to shecht an animal, and it's Shabbos. So you have a conundrum. Do we eat not kosher meat, and thereby not circumventing the need to shecht an animal on Shabbos, which is a malacha? Or do we say, hang on, it's not kosher, it's treif, shecht the animal, and then you have kosher meat? So the Rebbe says that we know the halacha in Shulchan Aruch is that if a person is ill on Shabbos and they need fresh meat, we shecht the animal, and the person should eat in order that the person should eat the kosher meat, which is interesting because eating not kosher is a lav. It's now no avera is benign. It's serious eating not kosher, but it's a regular avera. Shechting on Shabbos is a isur skila. It's a very, very egregious and severe avera, which, if done intentionally with warning and witnesses, being forewarned through witnesses, the person, if it was done intentional, would be stoned to death. And yet, we say it's better to shecht the kosher animal than to eat the treif. Why is that? So the rationale over here is because when a person shechts an animal, they commit an avera. It's very serious. It's a skila, but it's a one-off. You shecht the animal, and now you eat kosher meat. Whereas when the person were to eat nevela, not kosher meat, it's fresh. You don't need to shecht an animal. There's no slaughtering going on. But now every kazayas, every piece of meat that this person is going to ingest is another avera. And therefore, the ruling principle, the operating principle here is better do one serious avera than commit many, many smaller infractions, even though on their own they may be less serious. It's a fascinating discussion beyond the purview of the scope of what we're talking about now, but this lends us an insight into many, many perspectives on life, where we see from here one takeaway is that sometimes we obsess on quality over quantity. Is it better to do one thing good than many, many things that are not perfect? Or is it better just to do a little bit of something and a little bit, it will all add up together? Additionally, so we see from here is that in the negative, many, many little acts accumulate over time to being even greater than one perfect act, one more qualitatively superior act. And that's why we're saying it's one isser skila, one shechting of the animal, right, is, yes, it's serious, but compared to many, many times eating nevela, that is much worse. And therefore, the truth, this principle would operate in the inverse, in the positive. That is to say, many, many little good acts would prevail and be superior to one perfect act, one more powerfully or qualitatively superior act. That's why the Rebbe would talk about this idea based on the Rambam when it comes to tzedakah. Is it better to give, let's say a person wants to give $100. Is it better to give $100 in one time or 100 times to give $1? Where each time you give, it's challenging. There's even studies that are done on the neurological, psychological studies that each time a person gives something, there's certain neurons in the brain that are associated with pain, because it's difficult, it's challenging to give. So to give one time, even if it's $100, you get it done with. But every single time, $1 and another dollar, it's something that you constantly have to challenge yourself to give. Or in other areas, sometimes we want to do something perfect. It has to be 100%, and that's the only way we'll do it. We don't want to do a little bit like this, a little bit like that, which is counterintuitive. We would think we want perfection. But we know, as many people say, that perfection is the enemy of good and right. And therefore, sometimes we have to do what we can, because over time, every deed, every act that we do, as imperfect and as flawed as it may be, will ultimately amount to something very, very special. And therefore, going back to the story of Avram, he was confident that the Egyptians would rather murder him than commit adultery. And the Rebbe says this story, perhaps, is the source from where we learn that we shecht an animal for a sick person on Shabbos. Because Avram knew that murder, very serious, one of the 3 cardinal sins. But if the Egyptians desired Sarai, they murder him once, and that's it. Now she's free and clear. It's one serious cardinal sin, but now Sarai is available. Whereas if they let Avram live, and now they would commit adultery. So each time they're in a relationship, each time is a separate severe avera of eshes ish, of adultery. So they'd rather do one avera than commit many, many more. And thus, this is the meaning of that cryptic medrash that says, Imrina chaysiyat, please tell them that you're my sister. We see from here that you shecht for a chol on Shabbos. Because from the fact that we see that the Egyptians realize, in Avram's estimation, that it's better to commit one avera than to commit multiple averas, so too, in the instance of the chol on Shabbos, better to shecht the animal and have kosher meat than eat many kazayas of nevela. So this is Avram's calculations. This is what he's considering at this time. But back to the original question, okay, all right, that's your deliberation, that was your calculation, but still, what are you telling? Why are you telling Sarai you're leaving her twisting in the wind while you take care of yourself? So we'll present today 2 explanations. One explanation is based on the Zohar with added explanations in the Rebbe's writings. And that is, during his lifetime, Avram did not explain necessarily what his rationale was. But later, upon the passing of Sarai, and when he eulogizes her, he says something very profound. We know the famous Eshes Chayil, the famous poem in Mishlei, which was written by Shlomo HaMelech. Many ascribe and associate the composition of Eshes Chayil to Shlomo HaMelech. But according to a medrash, the Eshes Chayil was actually composed many, many years earlier by none other than Avram Avinu. It was his eulogy. It was his hesped that he gave for Sarah. And the truth is, if you read the Eshes Chayil and you study it, there are some indications that it really hints to this idea. We say in the Eshes Chayil mi yimtza, who will find? Kol yemei chayeha, all the days of her life, batischak liyom achron, and she was full of laughter and joy and happiness till the very last day. These are indications that we're talking about something that has passed on, something kol yemei chayeha, all the days of her life, yom achron, until the very last day. There are indications that this is a form of a eulogy, bemoaning and being nostalgic over events that transpired in the past. This is Avram's tribute to his dear wife, to his Eshes Chayil. So the Medrash So the Medrash Tanchuma, it highlights some of the words of this Eshes Chayil, and they refer to different events in the life. One of them refers precisely to this story. When it says, Batach ba leiv baila. Batach is bitachon. There was a certain confidence, a certain trust and assurance. Her husband. The Medrash says this refers to the time that Avram said to her, Imri na chesiyat. Gumalasu tov v'leira. This refers to the fact that Avram, Hetiv ba'avura, he was enriched. He received much on her account. What the Medrash is telling us over here is that contrary to what many perceive as the man, he is the one that is the security, the support for the wife. The truth is the other way around. In reality, it is the wife. She is the rock. She is the one that supports and protects her husband. Everything is in her schus. Of course, we see this throughout the stories of the Avos and the Imois. Hashem tells Avram, Kol asher tomer Sarah, everything that Sarah says, Shma b'koil, listen to her. It's not just about how to raise the children, how the chinuch, everything in their life. As we know that Avram was tefillah, he was subordinate, he was secondary in Nevi'us and prophecy to Sarah. There was a certain spiritual intuition that Sarah had that Avram didn't have. In fact, we see this clearly. We know the famous tradition that there were the 3 miracles that Sarah experienced every single time. There was the cloud over the tent, there was the fresh challah from week to week, and there was the candle that she lit would last the entire week. Upon her passing, clearly Avram continued lighting every single week. But we don't read about how this miracle returns in Avram's chus. It is only, we read about how when Yitzchak marries Rivka, it says then that all of the miracles that they knew she was the right one, because the miracles that we saw by Sarai were reintroduced again when Rivka married Yitzchak, not in Avram's chus. And we see this again in every single generation. Yitzchak with Rivka. Rivka is the one that knows who is deserving to get the brachos. The Yaakov is working in the field. It is the Imois that they raise the Shvatim. We see this it bears itself out many, many times. So what does the Zohar say? Explain. What is this? What's this idea? The idea is that Avram, when he looked at Sarai, he knew that she was protected. He would see an angel. There was this malach that would escort her wherever she went. But he looked around, there was no malach that was escorting him. And therefore Avram knew that it's not that he has to protect Sarah. Sarah has to protect him. And therefore he knew that in this predicament that they are in Mitzrayim, he has to figure out how to protect himself. It's interesting, he doesn't say, in other words, he doesn't declare to the Egyptians, Ani ach, I am the brother of Sarai. He actually puts it on her. He says, Imri na chesiyat, you should tell them that you're my sister. Because it is only through Sarai that Avram's protection would become materialized, would manifest itself. The Zohar explains thus why Avram asked for gifts. Because it's explained that the parnasa, the brachas that a man receives is in the schus of his wife. And therefore, he knew Hashem promised him that Vavarechecha, I will give you great blessings, which Rashi says, what does it mean? B'mamayin, that you will become wealthy. This is true physically, but also spiritually. Avram knew there was a special mission, why he had to come down to Mitzrayim. And therefore, he knew that if he can't receive those blessings in Canaan, then it is happening here somewhere in Mitzrayim. So he was looking every time, every opportunity that he had, where could he channel this blessing of Hashem? How could he create the vehicle through which Hashem's blessing should come to fruition? And therefore, if there was an opportunity, if there was a chance here in Mitzrayim, through the merit of Sarah, not exploiting her, but in fact coming to the realization, to the appreciation that it is through honoring his wife and through her being the primary channel through which his bracha will come. That is what his mission was. And therefore, ultimately, we see that from the words of based on what the Zohar is telling us, how the respect we have to have for each other and the husband and wife, not that, excuse me, not that we should think this one is the primary one, this one is the secondary one, but how each, the husband and the wife together, create that unit, create that special team through which the tremendous blessing comes through. But Avram, as dominant as he was, as famous as he was to the world, and spreading Yiddishkeit and taking on all those kings and all those wars, he never forgot. He always knew that the source of his blessing and his protection. Therefore, Avram says in this instance, Sarai, she's going to be okay. Hashem has her covered. There's the Malach. I'm not afraid for her. I'm afraid for myself. How am I going to survive? And therefore, he was actually asking her. He wasn't trying to finagle his way out of a situation and leave Sarah to her own devices. He was actually asking Sarai for protection. You will say that you're my sister. And ultimately, all the events that will come about will be biglalech, bavurech, due to your merit, due to your schos. There's a second explanation, and that is that of the Ramban. The Ramban teaches us a very, very powerful principle. We hear about it a lot. Paraphrasing the words of the Ramban, Maisa Avos Simin Laban. The Ramban actually says that what all the events that transpired to our ancestors, to our Avos, they portend and they are a siman to their descendants. It's interesting, he gives several examples, but in this story itself, there are many, many parallels to what happened to Avram and Sarah as they descend to Mitzrayim, to what will eventually happen to their descendants years later in Galus. And ultimately, each step, each phase was both a form of a portent, something that was a harbinger for what would be in the future, but it was far more than that. Avram and Sarah going down there, and Sarah, the Egyptians, taking Sarai to the house of Parai, that was something that would happen generations later. There was the decree to kill the male the male Jews. All of the daughters, all the females, to let them live. And this was something that wasn't just to let them live, but in fact, they tried to assimilate and to bring to take the Jewish culture and thoroughly transform it to one that is similar to the Egyptian culture, Ervas Haaretz, to do away with all the ethical and moral values and to follow the hedonistic pursuits that are innate to the human condition. What would be the strength? What would allow the Bnei Yisrael? We read about in the story of Mitzrayim, of course, unfortunately, many, many Jewish children were murdered. But we don't read about how all of the daughters were assimilated, who strayed from their path. In fact, we know that it says that it was the schus of the Nashim Tzidkanias, it was the Jewish women. They kept that identity, they kept their integrity in Mitzrayim. How did they manage to do that? The answer is, it was their ancestor Sarah, through her going into Mitzrayim. And that's why the Ramban explains that, in his view, Avram and Sarah going to Mitzrayim was a sin. It was a mistake. But he says, even if they made a mistake, Hashem orchestrated the events, Hashgach al Yono, through Hashem's pulling of the strings. He providenced that they should be there at that time for the future generations. Because an important and crucial key here was Avram and Sarah would go to Mitzrayim, they would return not only unscathed, but number one, there was these negayim, there was these afflictions that the Mitzrayim suffered. This portends the affliction, the plagues, the makkos that would happen many years later. Avram is sent away with gifts, with riches. Many years later, they will leave with tremendous wealth that they will borrow, so to speak, from the Mitzrayim. So there's a very, very tremendous, important message here. And that is that when we say Maisa Avisim and Labanim, it's not just that this is some kind of sign, a symbol for future generations, but in fact, to know that the children, they look at their parents and they want to see what they should do. I was just reading a story. It was the sister of my grandmother, of my maternal grandmother, of my paternal grandmother. Her name was Chasha, and she was living in Russia. And of course, under the communist rule, things were very, very difficult. One of the challenges at the time was they would have to send their kids to the schools every single day of the week, including Shabbos. Specifically on Shabbos was a very, very challenging day because they would intentionally give these children these tests, and they would have to write to desecrate the Shabbos. This was something that was very, very painful. And every single week, Chasha would try to figure out a way to come some excuse. She's sick. She's every time we have to go to this place and that place. Every week there's another excuse why she couldn't bring. It was her son Shloima. I believe he was around 9 years old at the time, and why he couldn't attend school. And one week the teacher said, if your son Shloima is not in school this week, on Saturday, I will report you to the authorities. You will be deported to Siberia, to the slave camps, and you'll never see your family again. Now she has to figure out what should she do, and she's all nervous. There's no excuses. Anyways, she's taking her kid to school. It's a Saturday morning, and she meets along the way. It's her husband, Moshe, and a fellow chassid, Reb Mendel Futterfass. And they're looking at her and they know what she's going through, and they don't know what to say. This Reb Mendel's looking down on the ground. He can't bring himself to say anything. And her husband, Reb Moshe, says, "Listen, do whatever you think you have to do." They had nothing to say. That was such a devastating situation. And she's walking along on the way to the school, and all of a sudden she notices there's this big, muddy puddle on the side of the road. All of a sudden, without thinking, she takes her 9-year-old son and throws him into this muddy puddle. And then she drags him off to the school. As soon as he shows up, they see this little boy. He's covered in mud and water, and it's a freezing cold day. And they said, "You got to go home. You got to change because you're going to catch a cold. You're going to get sick." And that's how she was able to not bring him to school that Shabbos. On the way back, they see her coming back with the kid, and they see him. He's covered in mud, drenched, and they ask her, how did you find within yourself the strength, the fortitude to be able to do such a thing? And like, what inspired you?" So she said, when I was walking to this kid's school today, I was full of dread and anxiety. And all of a sudden, I had this image of my father, who was a chassid, Reb Shlomo Raskin, a chassid of the Rebbe. And I had this image of one year. It was the last year that the Frierdiker Rebbe was in Russia. As we know, the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, the Rayatz, He was, because of what they called counter-revolutionary activities, he was initially sentenced to death. And after a tremendous political effort, his life was spared, and he was ultimately told that he must leave Russia. It was the last Tishrei that he was there. And it was many Hasidim wanted to go, but it was also very, very dangerous to go because there were many spies, many communists who were in the community, and they would inform on people who would come. And my father, Reb Shlomo, he decided that he needs to go no matter what. And he spent that last Tishrei with the Frierdiker Rebbe. When he came back, he was totally finished. He was sick, and he was exhausted, and he could barely move. But as soon as he came home, he came into the house and he stood on the table and he started dancing. But he was hoarse. He had no voice. He could barely stand. And then all of a sudden he picks up a chumash and he starts dancing, mimicking the dances, the actions of what he saw by the Frierdiker Rebbe. And he said with the last gasp, his cracked voice, he repeated what the Frierdiker Rebbe said. And he said that when it comes to our children, we need to have mesiras nefesh. We need to have a special sacrifice for their chinuch, for their education. And with those last words, he collapsed out of exhaustion, out of tiredness. And she said, that image of my father saying that we need to give everything that we have when it comes to educating our children, we need to sacrifice everything. That powerful image was emblazoned in my mind, in my memory. When I was taking my son to the school, that's what, as soon as I saw that, it was just obvious what I had to do. And I think one of the ideas that the Ramban is teaching us about Maisa Avos Siman Labanim, that Avram and Sarah, we know that our ancestors, they were called Avos, they were called Imahos. It's a very interesting term to use, not our heroes, our legends, our generals, our pioneers. They're called Avos Imahos, our mothers and our fathers, because primarily what was unique about them and what guided their lives, every decision that they made, wasn't about, what's the easy thing to do, what should we do in any situation, any challenge that they encountered, which we know they encountered many. What guided their decision was, in every instance, they asked themselves, what we're going to do in a day, in a month, a year, in a generation, our children are going to look up and read about or hear about or even see what we're going to do. We need to ask ourselves, is that what we want our children to learn? Is that what we want them, the kind of path that they should take in their lives? That was their guiding principle. Avos Imos. And therefore, the Maisa Avos Siman Labanim, the actions that Avram and Sarah took at that time, was both on a spiritual level. Sarah was able to neutralize the klippos, the forces of evil, the darkness, the wickedness, the evil of Mitzrayim, through going into the house of Pare, into his palace, and to remain untouched. That happened, that was a sort of a spiritual battle that took place. And Avram clearly saw his, together as a unit, they had to deal with that. But also on a physical level, literally, Maisa Avos Siman Labanim, they were the trailblazers. In future generations, they opened up the doors. They created that possibility through their pioneering actions that when we, whether it's a Jewish girl or a Jewish boy in any predicament, where they face that challenge and they ask themselves, could I deal with this? Could I deal with all these difficult decisions that we have in life? The allure of what our culture, our society, what the milieu that we live in. And there's a lot that we have to deal with, each and every one of us, every single day. But knowing that our ancestors, they overcame that and they were the first, it makes it a lot easier. Ultimately, then, through Avram and Sarah being the Av and the Aim, the Avos and the Imos, we too, in turn, become the avasimos in our lives, in our families. And therefore, every decision that we make, every action that we take should be often, when we make these decisions, we should ask ourselves, what is the message? What do I want to teach my child? What do I want them to emulate and to, in turn, pass on to their children? And therefore, we come to that realization that before we start making those demands of our children, we have to start making the demands of ourselves. And through that, we inspire ourselves to lead a life that our parents taught us, we in turn shape and forge the next generation. The Rebbe wrote in a letter, a fascinating point. He says that oftentimes the children, when they look up to their parents, the lives and careers and their achievements and their lifestyle in general, their character, they often look up to them and they say, you know, if I would just be half of what my mother or my father or my bubby and my Zaidi were, I would be happy. Imagine I would just be a fraction of that. If I could live up to a half of what they did, that would also be amazing. And the Rebbe said, therefore, we have to know that when we, in turn, educate our children, we should be asking, we should be demanding double than what we really expect. Because if our children are only going to live up to half, therefore we need to up the ante. We actually have to raise the level. So therefore, in the end, perhaps they'll live up to that expectation. So may it be Hashem's will, in the parsha of Lech Lecha, each and every one of us have that journey. We have that call. Hashem calls each and every single one of us in our own way, Lech Lecha, to go on a certain path, a certain journey in life. And no two journeys are the same. And we don't understand why each person has their journey and all of the twists and turns. And sometimes it feels that instead of going forward, we're actually going backward. But El Haaretz Asher Areka, there is that land that we are ultimately getting to, that Hashem shows us, our destination, our promised land. And may it be Hashem's will that Hashem gives each and every one of us the koyach. By telling us Lech Lecha, we go on that path, we should reach that destination. We should all together reach to that land, Asher Areka, which Hashem will show us with the coming of Mashiach, B'mehera v'yameinu, amen. I have now unmuted everyone. If anyone has any comments, questions, critique, Mirz Hashem, we will return next week on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock as per usual. Have all a Shavua Tov, a wonderful week to all.